Buenas, bienvenidos a este vídeo de unplandivino.net. Vamos a visualizar con Clau un taller de Miller. Al principio vamos a empezar. ¿Qué tal, Claudia, desde Argentina?
Hola, muy bien, Iván.
Gracias.
Disfrutando de este momento. Sí, gracias.
Pues nada, aquí va a ir muy despacito con las cosas de siempre. El taller se llama, por ese orden, Lógica, Emociones, verdad y verdad, que no sé, para no asustar, quizá mejor llamarlo nosotros emociones, lógica y verdad. Quizá primero emociones, que vende más, ¿no? Pero bueno, la lógica es tan importante en estos casos cuando le metemos el asunto de los espíritus, la influencia. Luego, si comentamos algo brevemente, quizá después de la hora y pico que va a durar esta visualización, porque el taller es largo, pues ya lo comentamos eso, que no se nos olvide decir lo que queramos. Entonces lo vamos apuntando e intentamos no interrumpir esto, a ver si se nos da bien. Si podemos no interrumpir, porque siempre da mucha ganas de comentar, pero bueno, vamos a verlo de seguido, como últimamente. A ver, y si, bueno, si se oye bien, pues nada, no me dices nada y ya tiramos para adelante.
Dale.
Ahí vamos.
Part of the human soul series of talks that I've been doing.
O sea, esto forma parte de la serie del alma humana.
I was just thinking of calling it something like Emotions Extended or something like that, but it's actually an overview of emotions is what I would like to raise with you today.
A ver, entonces vamos a pasar por este momento. Un tema del que ha estado tratando con bastante frecuencia, recordatorio sobre cómo trabajaros las emociones, por así decir, emociones y verdad. Escribe lo de que es la serie de charlas sobre el alma humana. Y estaba pensando en llamarla Estamos por ahí.
Now, the reason why I'd like to raise that with you, I'll just get a better pen. The reason why I'd like to raise that with you today is that what I'm finding in my visits with people face to face is that a lot of people are still finding it very, very difficult to get their head out of the way of what's going on inside of themselves emotionally. And to actually recognise fully what's going on inside of themselves emotionally. And we find that what's happening many times is that we get to a point where we thought we knew a lot of information, and then after a while through our emotional work, we get to a point where we realise that all of that stuff we thought we knew, it was only a thought, and it wasn't yet a feeling. So what I would like to do first is describe to you how to look at yourself in terms of your emotional work, in terms of getting closer to God and also getting closer to yourself. So remember that this process, the process of receiving God's love, is not just about getting closer to God, but it's also about coming to know yourself fully. So, and it's one of the only ways, in fact, that you can ever come to know yourself fully. So let's do a bit of an overview first, shall we? So what are we made up of? We've got our physical body, yes? So let's go. Our spiritual body and our soul. Let's put our soul like that, or let's just draw it, instead of drawing it like that, I'll draw it as the half of the soul that we actually are. And in this case, it's the man, so just half of the male soul. The feminine part of the soul, obviously, is the other half. And the physical body, spirit body. Where is our mind? Okay, so our mind is in the spirit body's mind. The brain in the physical body is just used as a tool for the mind to exercise. So there's the mind. But you notice that it's not the soul. It's not the real you. The real you is the soul. Now, if you consider that as the general thing, and so we do that, mind of the spirit body for this side is in there as well. So that's the mind. When you use your intellectual reasoning, that's what you're using. Now, the problem that we have on Earth is that we get so used to using our mind to do everything that we start at a very, very young age tuning out of our real emotions and the feelings that are in our soul. So what finishes up happening is during the times we're growing up, eventually our mind overcomes our feelings and emotions so much that in the end we don't feel our emotions very well by the time we become adults. And a lot of the times we have no idea what we're really feeling, and we've got to sit and let ourselves feel before we even can discover what we're really feeling, because our mind has been used so much, it's so dominant, that to actually connect back to our feelings is a difficult process. So what I would like to do today is to talk more about how emotions work, why this is all very important for us to work through if we want to have a relationship with God and a relationship with ourselves. And also we want to speak about how do we determine the truth of an emotion, or the truth in any form? How do we recognise truth as a part of this process? Because a part of this process, of course, is understanding truth. Now, the reason why we're discussing the emotions, if we can talk about that first, is because the emotions are the beginning of understanding humility. And remember, in the process that we've been describing, you've got humility as your number one quality that we really need to develop if we're going to ever know ourselves and if we're ever going to know God. We need to have humility. Humility opens the doorway to our reception of truth. So truth is the next step, understanding the truth. Now, that's not just understanding the truth with our mind. That's actually feeling the truth with our heart. That's a part of the process. So we need to do that. And then once we do that, we can now unblock ourselves to the reception of love. So once we've opened our heart, which is the process of humility, opening our heart, and then we've opened our heart, now we have the ability to receive truth into our heart. And once we can receive truth into our heart, the truth helps us come to terms with what is the truth about ourselves and the truth about God and the truth about the universe. And in that process, we can then long for love and receive some. But if we haven't got that openness in our heart, then it's impossible to receive that love anyway. And it's our soul, this part of us here, that is the functional part that does all of this, not our mind. And most of us still usually begin with our mind rather than beginning with our soul. And after you progress on the divine love path for a long period of time, generally you start getting to this point where it switches over or around, and no longer are your thoughts the dominant thing in your life, but rather your emotions are. And you start realizing that your emotions drive all of your thoughts, actually. And this is why psychologists have come up with this concept of subconscious. The reason why they view it as your subconscious driving your actions is because there is a heavy suppression of the emotion. And when there's a heavy suppression of the emotion, you are now using your mind thinking that you're logical, but the reality is that your mind is still being heavily dominated by the emotions that you're suppressing. So therefore, oftentimes we're not as logical as we'd like to believe in our mind, because our soul, our emotions, which are inside of our soul, drive a lot of our experiences still. So what we would like to do is understand that becoming humble means becoming humble to what we really feel, not what we would like to believe we feel. They're two very, very different things. What we really feel and what we'd like to believe we feel are completely the opposite in many cases. So you see this very much when you meet some people who have been in religions for many years. They have a very strong opinion about what they are as a character, and yet quite often, right in that same moment, they can be almost as unloving as a murderer can be. In fact, religiously, if you look over the entire world, there are many times that religions drive people to murder another person because they're not in harmony with their belief systems. Now, that tells you that their mind allows them to go ahead with that act, and yet if they were connected to their heart, they would never be able to go ahead with a murderous act. So there's something wrong. There's obviously some kind of discrepancy between what's really going on and what they think is going on. And this is why we need to discuss this subject quite in detail. So let's start with that. Now, I'm not suggesting in this discussion that we have to throw away logic. In fact, my feelings are that God gave us a brain, and God gave us also the spirit, body's mind, which is capable of logical reasoning. So therefore, it is something that is necessary to be used in the discovery of truth. So you don't want to throw away your mind. You want to allow your mind to see what is really within your soul. And that's a very, very different process than throwing away the intellect altogether. So we're not suggesting that you all of a sudden just become a totally emotional being without any mental check on what your actions or anything might be leading you towards, but rather you need to come to terms with 3 or 4 primary things with regard to your mind. So let's look at with regard to the mind. The first one is any intellectual reasoning that you are unsure of you need to just go ahead and experiment. So in other words, let's say you have a thought. Let's say during the course of a day, something happens and you have a thought that you believe that the universe is flat. And if you didn't have any other context of which to measure this thought that you've just had, and this, by the way, was a thought that many people had 1,000 years ago, that the universe and, in fact, the earth was flat, and then you would have to put it in the unsure basket because you have no way of proving whether it's flat or not, aside from travelling. And unless you had the means to travel, you would not be able to test the truth with regard to whether the universe or the earth itself is flat. And so what you would do with a thought like that, because it's a thought that you're unsure of the answer, you would put it in the experimentation basket. Does that make sense? So in other words, you'd say, all right, I'm not sure what the answer to this question is, so that means I need to do more experimentation with that particular question. So instead of coming up with an idea of, that the earth is flat and then sticking with it, even if it's unproven, what you would do is inside of yourself, you'd go, anything that's unproven to me, and it doesn't matter whether it's proven to somebody else, this needs to be related to you. If it's unproven to me, then I need to put it in the experimentation basket. I'm going to experiment with it. Does everyone get that? So any intellectual reasoning or any intellectual thought you have that falls into that basket. So, for example, in a relationship, you might have a thought all of a sudden that your wife doesn't love you anymore. Right? Now, there could be a whole lot of things that are not proven about that yet, and you'd need to, and you're unsure of it, so you'd need to put it in the experiment basket. You'd need to put it into this thought requires my attention and requires further investigation. Can you see that? Let's say it's something about the universe. Let's say you were designing an aeroplane and you were, 200 years ago when planes weren't yet invented, and you wanted to come up with some kind of thought that, I can definitely create a flying machine, but you'd have no way of doing it. You don't know how. So what you would do is you would allow yourself to experiment. You would build a flying machine. The first one you build probably wouldn't work, so you build another one, and you build another one until you start working out how it works. And that's a part of the experimenting process. Does that make sense? Mary, you'd like to ask? By the way, you can ask questions through this, and we'd just like to record your questions.
So really this is the process that we're in with regards to our soul. We're experimenting with the fact that because it's for most of us.
We're even experimenting with the fact that we have a soul.
Yeah.
Does that make sense to everyone? You can't say that when I get up here in front of you and I tell you, look, you've got a soul. You can't straight away say, well, yeah, I believe that, without knowing for certain through a process of experimenting. Can you see that? So we have to experiment with some things if we want to determine the truth or not. Okay, yeah. Okay, so that's number one. And remember, this is to do with the intellect. So we're not discounting the intellect. We are stating that the intellect will often come up with thoughts. Thoughts will be just dropped into your head. Now, where they come from is debatable. Now, sometimes they come from within yourself. Sometimes a thought gets dropped into your head. You'll be driving along, you got the radio turned on in the car, and the presenter on the radio drops a thought into your head. Or you might be home just meditating or something like that, and then all of a sudden you have a feeling and a certain thought drops into your head that seems to be related to that feeling. And that is a thought that I would say would be dropped into your head from a spirit. It doesn't really matter where the thought's from. The fact that you're unsure about it means that it needs more experimentation. So everyone understand that? That's number one. Okay. 2, intellectual thoughts and thoughts that are harmonious with love must always be retained as truth. All right, if we can turn off those mobiles or whatever there. And intellectual thoughts that are harmonious with love must always be retained as truth. So in other words, if you have an intellectual thought and you can see that this thought is very much in harmony with love, then it's something that you should retain even if you don't believe it yet. You need to retain it as truth inside of yourself because it's harmonious with love. In other words, love will tell you what's truth or not. There is a direct relationship between love and truth. So love will tell you what's truth. The third thing is intellectual thoughts that are disharmonious with love must be discarded as error. So if you have an intellectual thought, oh, I'd like to murder that guy. That's a thought that's popped into your mind. You don't know where it's come from. It might have come from yourself. It might have come from a spirit. It might come from prompting of other people around you. It could come from any source. But it's obviously out of harmony with love of the other guy and yourself. So therefore, it needs to be discarded. It needs to be thrown away. It's something that you can trust is not truth, not something that you need to act upon, not something that you need to experiment with. Does that make sense to everyone? Very basic, these three very basic principles will help us with to determine truth if we follow them. All right? So we've got intellectual reasoning that we are unsure of. We need to put it in the experimentation basket. We've got intellectual reasoning and thoughts that are harmonious with love we need to hold on to and keep, even if we feel the different opposite to it. We still need to hold on to it and keep it. And intellectual thoughts that are disharmonious with love, we need to throw away, even if we want to hold on to it. We need to throw it away because it's obviously not truth. Because we can measure whether something is truthful or not by whether it is loving or not. That's the underlying premise. Okay?
Usually when we're coming from a place of error, we're going to really know what's loving sometimes. We think it's loving, but then we later on find out it's not, perhaps.
If you have that suspicion, then I'd say that it falls into basket number one. Unsure. And if I'm unsure, then I need to experiment further before I know. Does that make sense? So every time, even if there are times, I agree, where you think something is loving, but God's got a feedback system, the law of attraction, which will tell you whether it's loving or not down the track if you embrace it. And to me, that falls into the unsure basket. I'm not 100% positive that is love or not yet, and so I need to experiment with it.
Even from our environment, like in a family situation where we think it's right to treat a person a certain way because that's what we've been shown all our life, we have a belief. If that's the way it happens.
Yes, so the first thing I would do there intellectually is I'd go, well, would I like to be treated that way? Well, if I wouldn't like to be treated the way that I'm treating that family member, then it's obviously in the third category and I need to discard that treatment. If I would like to be treated the way that I'm treating that family member, then it has to fall into one of these two boxes, where it's either loving or I'm not sure whether it's loving yet.
So really it involves a lot of self-reflection, I guess, doesn't it?
It does.
Reaction.
It does. Yeah. The beauty of it, to a large degree, is initially when you compare these three intellectual thoughts or types of intellectual thoughts, you can usually draw a line along there. In other words, you can say, I don't know yet, or I know for certain. And here you know for certain something is wrong. So most of us in our heart would know for certain that murder is wrong or murder is unloving. So therefore we wouldn't take that action. If a murderer was trying to justify a murder, he might not know. So he would fall into this. So he'd have to experiment with it before he actually engaged the action. This is before you engage any action. Does that make sense?
What I can see is that...
There's a mute button on it, in fact. Sorry, and don't worry about it, that's me.
A common problem I see, though, is people seeing something that's loving, but then it's obviously taxing on themselves, and they could leave it as thinking that it's a loving and harmonious thought and go off and be helping all these other people at a cost to themselves.
So to me, Again, the law of attraction would be they'd embrace it like they think this is true here. They believe they know that it's true here.
Yeah.
But through their emotional process, which is what we're going to add to this.
Yeah.
But through their emotional process, they'll eventually come to see that they feel tired. And if they feel tired, something's wrong.
Yeah.
So straight away, they know something must be wrong. This is only, so far I've only presented half of what we need to do.
That's right. Maybe I'm thinking ahead a little.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So this is half, and this is the intellectual half. So here we're focused on the intellectual half of what we need to do if we're going to discover truth. Does everyone get that? But it's not the whole story yet. Yeah? There's another 3 things that we need to do at an emotional level to really discover the truth. And we need to put it all together rather than separating it from each other. So at the moment, we could be looking at this only from an intellectual point only. You can see that while, it's going to be helpful, it's not going to be certain, is it? It's not going to have a definite outcome yet. That we need to add things to it before we have a definite outcome. Vera and then Mary.
I'm really stuck in my head.
Yeah.
And number one, like it sounds easy, but I'm so stuck in so many things. I can't even come up with the right experiments. Like how do you find the right questions to ask to experiment with?
Well, each one of these things, I suppose, has a whole extra set of things we can do. But the first thing I would do is pray. Because praying, you're talking to the creator of your own self. And so therefore, anything you're unsure of, the first thing to do would be engage prayer. Remember prayer being a desire that you have for God to tell you truth. And so if you had a desire for God to tell you truth, then you would need to observe. So the next thing I would do is observe what happens over the next few days of my life. So this is a part of the experimentation process. And we can talk about the experimentation process as a separate issue, I feel. The main thing we need to do firstly is understand what box it goes into. So most of the time, if we don't know what box it goes into, then it's in box number 1. If we think that we're being loving, then it's box number 2. And if we know that it's not loving, then it's box number 3. So it's quite a simple intellectual choice at this point. How to go about experimentation is a different discussion, which we might put more information on a bit later after I've presented the other half. Is that all right? Yep. Mary?
I was just feeling that it seems like most of the world just operates with this set of rules, really, don't we?
Yes.
We inherit a lot of beliefs, usually from our parents or environment, and they say
teachers as truth.
This is truth. This is loving. This isn't. It's not loving, and we just sort of stick between 2 and 3. And most, like before I met you, for example, I didn't even engage my soul in
an experimentation process.
In experimenting. Even intellectually, I didn't really consider much.
There's a main reason why we don't do number 1, and that is that we are told we're not allowed to make mistakes. And number 1 is all about making mistakes.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? So we're told so much in society and in our upbringing that we're not allowed to make mistakes. And so what we finish up doing is we finish up engaging, not engaging number 1 because we don't even want to admit that a mistake can be made. And so what we do is number 2 or 3.
Yes.
Do you want me to say that again?
No. I got it.
Yeah.
Thank you. But I think it leads to the second part of what I feel for myself is this, you're talking about not being able to make mistakes. And I think because of that, every time I engage my soul and I discover something that might not be loving, I use my intellect to skip over it, or to try to force my emotions into what my intellect says is loving, rather than feel the uncertainty of it all and the feeling like I could be in error. I suppose.
Yes, a lot. A lot of people revert to this or this as a reasoning because they're not prepared to do this. They're not prepared to go through the process of not knowing. They want to know before they begin an experimentation process, right? And experimenting with life is essential if you're going to get to know yourself, but it's also essential if you're going to get to know God or anybody else. You can't even have a relationship without it being an experiment, really, can you? If you think about it. So we need to engage this actively. We need to stop judging ourselves for not knowing, in other words. We need to be happy that we don't know, because we can put it in box number 1 and experiment with the knowledge, and by engaging a process that we can talk about in a minute. Yeah. Does that make sense to everyone? Like, everyone gets that so far? So we're a bit in the mind at this point, trying to understand the soul-based process, but it's important for us to understand it. So is there any questions about the intellect here, like the intellectual process up the back there? Yeah. Oh, sorry. Oh, we were coming. Oh, Joy wants to ask one. If we go there and then up the back.
Thanks. Maybe this is in the next part too, that I can see them, like there are emotions obviously that drive the I don't want to be wrong stuff that affects number 1.
There are.
But also in number 3, I'm kind of stuck on, well, I can't just discard this murderous thought or whatever it is, because there are emotions that are driving that as well.
Yes, when I say discarded, because it's a thought, you can discard thoughts. Feelings are a bit different. Feelings are a bit harder to discard. We can discuss how to discard them, but they're a bit harder to discard. Yep. Any other questions up the back there? Yep.
I was just wondering whether you might give an example, kind of not sure of your context in terms of the first question, the first statement.
I'm saying that anything you could possibly think of that in the universe that arrives to you as a thought, anything. If you're unsure of the answer, then it goes into box number 1.
Okay, it's big.
It's so big. Yeah. Anything that you could possibly conceive. Right? So you pick up a musical instrument, sit it on your lap, and the question you have is, how do I play it? The answer is, I'm unsure. So what do? You need to experiment. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
What most people do with a musical instrument, they pick up the music instrument, look at it in confusion, and even though they love music, they don't want to go through the process of experimenting and failing and making mistakes. And so for the majority of persons, like if I ask an audience generally, put up your hand if you love music. Almost everybody in the audience generally puts up their hand. Put up your hand if you play music. You see, like there's like 1/4, maybe less, who play music. Now, why is there a discrepancy between the people who love music and the people who play music? It's because the other people have not yet experimented with the playing of music. Does that make sense? It's just that because they're unsure, or a lot of things might have happened in their childhood which cause them to feel like they can't really do that, or it's not possible, or they might have things happening in their life that cause them to feel like it's too hard to go through the process of practicing an hour a day to get used to it now because, you're busy, you've got a busy life. There might be all sorts of reasons, but it really is something that you need to experiment with. If you love music and you don't play it, then why not experiment with it and be prepared for the fact that you're going to probably fail when you first start. And in fact, everybody who learns how to play a musical instrument goes through the usually first 10 to 20 weeks is a feeling of failure. Yeah, almost everybody that you ever hear of learning an instrument as an adult. As a child, they don't worry about that generally so much. They're a bit more accepting of failure when we're a child than we are as an adult. Yeah? So yes, this applies to everything you could think of and on every subject you could think of in the universe that could come into your mind. So it's a large scope. Okay. Is there any more questions about the intellect? No? So shall we proceed with the emotions? Now, the emotional content of looking at whether something is true or not is almost identical to this, and all we need to take out are the words intellectual reasoning and replace them with the word emotions. So let's do that. So we got 1, emotions that you are unsure of. The answer to we need to experiment with. That's basically number 1. Mary?
Are you saying if we're unsure if they're loving? Are you saying
if we're unsure that they're loving, we're unsure that they're truthful, we're unsure that they...
So if I feel like you... you don't love me,
yeah,
then I need to, but I don't know, is that the truth or is that just a feeling that I'm having?
exactly.
Yeah.
So you need to experiment.
Yeah.
So you need to find out the answer to that, like,
So,
particularly if we're in a relationship. Yeah.
Yeah. It's an interesting example.
Yeah.
But so this whole process is really designed to help us discover the truth of everything.
The truth of everything.
Which is something that we can discover.
Which is something we are able to discover. Yep. God created a beautiful universe that we're able to discover the truth of on every single subject imaginable. But we have to engage a process. So number 2. So it's basically 2 is the same as this one. So emotions that are harmonious with us must always be retained. When I say retained and felt as truth, they are the truth. If they're harmonious with love, they are the truth. Diane.
When you say must always be retained, you can't actually discard them, can you? When
probably retained isn't the right word I should be using. It's probably just felt. Must be felt as truth. So emotions pass through you. They don't stay with you. As you know, in the course of a day, you can have many emotions, right? And in one day, you could have loving emotions come up, and you can have very hateful emotions come up, very angry emotions come up, very sad emotions up, all in the course of one day. And that's because emotions have the ability to pass through you, and so you can feel them as they come. So emotions that are harmonious with love must always be felt, but they must always be respected. There's truth as well, because they're harmonious with love. Remember, there's this relationship between love and truth. Right? And I'm not just talking about your own truth here. I'm talking about God's truth, like universal truth. So the way we can know whether something is truthful as an emotion is when we're feeling something, is if it has a love as its basis. So is anger a love-based emotion? Some people would maybe say that it is, but it obviously isn't. It always causes somebody pain, usually anger does. So I would say that that is an emotion that is not harmonious with love, and therefore you must feel it as error, not truth. So whenever you are angry, it's capable of telling you the truth, but it's not, if you live in the anger, if you just live in the anger and become enraged with the world, then it's not going to be harmonious with love, and therefore it's not harmonious with God's truth. Right? These things are going to confront some of you as we go through. So let's, Mary.
So I'm just interested in what you're saying about anger and truth.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to think of, I would love for you to describe, and I have some experience of observing you do this, but this is something I still grapple with, but how you determine truth through understanding love and your other emotions. I watch you do that all the time. Can you give an example of how you do that?
Well, what say we finish the three? And then what we need to, of course, merge this together, because if we use our emotions without our intellect, we are going to have certain dangers. And if we use our intellect without our emotion, we're going to have certain dangers. We're not going to be able to determine the truth if we do one or the other. We have to amalgamate the two of them together. Right? So it's very important to understand that what we're trying to do is discover a way here of experimenting and discovering truth ourselves, not having to rely on anybody else in the universe. Or anybody else on earth for the discovery of truth. This is how can we discover truth ourselves, right? So you remember everything that we're trying to teach myself and Mary is how to become self-aware and self-responsible. So you want to get to a stage where you don't have to listen to anybody else about what's true or not if you don't want to, and still be able to discover truth for yourself, right? You think about a scientist who's on the forefront of any type of endeavour. He has nobody else to tell him what is true or not. So what does he do? He's unsure when he begins, and what does he do? He experiments. So scientists are very, very used to experimenting in the physical layer or physical level generally, right? Now, there's a whole set of scientific endeavour that could be investigating in a spiritual layer, but that's not as popular. And what I'm saying is, on any layer, we need to experiment. So any spiritual layer or soul-based layer we need to experiment with if we are unsure of truth. If we the way I see life is I sort of see it like a scientist sees physical life. A scientist sees physical life as something to just enjoy the discovery process of. And that's how I see all my life, as something that we can go through the process of experimenting with in every aspect of our life. We don't, not limited to physical life, but spiritual life, our love relationships, all of the things in our life that we could ever engage, we can experiment with and find the truth of every single time. That's what I'm saying. Okay, let's put number 3 just to write it down, because I think we know what it is now. So it's emotions that are disharmonious with love must be released as error. So I have a feeling inside of me of resentment for somebody, and that resentment has built now to such a point that I would really like to harm them. Like I'd really like to punish them somehow, like attack them or, do something to their life that hurts them. Now, obviously, that is out of harmony with love, that feeling. Now, it has to be released as error. In other words, instead of acting upon it as a truth, I need to go, right, it's an emotion that's out of harmony with love. So I need to stop acting upon it, and I need to somehow, and we talk about how as we go along, I need to somehow release it. I need to somehow get it out of me so that it's not in me anymore. And once it's not in me anymore, it won't define my life anymore. Does that make sense? And once it doesn't define my life anymore, then I'll be free of that emotion and I'll have gotten rid of something inside of me that's out of harmony with love. Yeah. So how are we going so far? All right? So
what I have trouble with is if someone's telling me something and yet I'm getting a different feeling than what they're telling me, and then I don't know whether my feelings are wrong or they're telling me an untruth, and I just get totally
so that falls into basket number 1 on this side, doesn't it?
Yeah, but then I don't know how to experiment.
So you can you see that part of the problem is most of us have got no idea how to experiment? That's part of the problem here, isn't it? You see, we're so used to either going there or there every time in our life or being forced to go there and there every time in our life through society and through our upbringing. In other words, we've been told what truth is and we've been told what error is and we have given no choice to experiment. Right? That's how we've been brought up, most of us. And as a result of that, we have no idea how to go through an experimenting type of process. And we also have a lot of emotional impediments associated with going through a process because we hate not knowing, right? Usually inside of ourselves. So what we do is we try to convince ourselves that we know, even when we don't know. It's like I remember once opening the bonnet of a vehicle, and there was a woman, and I asked her to point out the battery to me, and her father, as a joke, had pointed out the carburetor as a battery to her when she was young, as a joke, and she completely believed that the carburetor was the battery. Right? And that's the problem, is that how does she correct that error? By only experimenting. But because she just accepted Daddy's word, like a bit of a cruel thing to do as a dad to do. He might have thought it was a joke at the time, but a bit cruel. And now she was adamant, like that's the car, that's the battery there. Bit hard to take that battery out and replace it. So she needs to experiment. And the problem is that most of the people around us do not like us experimenting. Have you noticed that? Yeah, most people around us don't like us to experiment. So this is the problem we face, is how do we go about these experiments, right? Many of us have very large emotional impediments to experimentation. One of the primary impediments are that we wish to retain the approval of others while we're experimenting. That's one of our primary impediments. So if you imagine the Wright brothers, when they were building their aeroplane, having to retain the approval of others while they were doing their experiments, I wonder how long it would have taken them to then achieve flight. A much longer time than it did by them not listening to anybody and trusting their own intellect and experiments emotionally. Right? So if you look at every new thing, every new endeavour that has ever been created on this planet, the person who created it was willing to experiment. and willing to experiment without the approval of others. Yeah.
So it's really curiosity, isn't it? Like children are curious, so we maintain that.
So you think of a childlike view of this experiment. If we focus on that, the first one is curiosity. Yes, now I'm sticking to my own. Thanks, guys. It's meant to stop me from tripping over it, but it stuck me to it instead. Curiosity is a major part of this experimentation process. Yeah. What else does a child do when it experiments? Have you noticed? Use your mic.
Sorry. They're much more emotionally open than certainly I am. So,
could you say they're open?
They're open.
Transparent?
Yep. Yeah.
Non-critical? No, they just absorb like a sponge. They're like a sponge, aren't they?
And they're desirous.
They have desire, yeah, good. Yeah. Anything else you can think of that a child is? Bring the mic over.
I was just going to say they're in awe.
They're in awe. They're not sort of like, you know what we do as adults? We hear one sentence, and by the time we've got to the second sentence, a lot of times we've already made up our mind. That's often the case. A child doesn't do that, do they? They listen to the whole thing generally, particularly if they've asked you, like, how many of you have had children? Right? How many of your children have said, Daddy, Daddy, how does this work? Daddy, why does that happen? Daddy, why does this happen? Or Mummy, why does that happen? Why is this? Why is that? Why is this? Why is that? Have you noticed that when they're very young? Both of my boys did exactly that all the time. Like, Daddy this, Daddy that, Daddy this, question, 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 question. So they are willing to ask questions. So this is part of the process of experimenting. Joy, if you just show Joy on that camera as well. So
they don't have any fear.
So they've got very little fear or no fear generally. And if they do have fear, a lot of times it's our parental reflected fear anyway.
They're very trusting.
They trust, yes. They don't. It's interesting, this attitude of trust. They don't trust necessarily that the answer is correct, but they are open enough to trust that the person who's giving the answer is being honest. Does that make sense? So they at least trust that. Later on, they work out whether the answer is correct or not, generally. Yes.
They're not invested in an outcome.
Okay, yes. No investment. Now, you think how often we ask questions that we've got total investment in comparison? Yeah. All right, so child, no investment in the outcome. The child is going, okay. Like, there's no emotional investment in the outcome. Mary?
Just in the asking questions, they're very honest about the fact that they don't know or that they're in a process of experimentation.
So they're humble.
They're humble. They're not afraid. Some people would call that vulnerable, but they don't even feel vulnerable. They just feel trusting.
In fact, they view it as a normal course of their daily life that they should have the right to ask a question. So they don't, and it's only when we suppress them, stop asking questions. And you see a lot of parents, like when they're in a shopping centre or something, you're walking along with a child, like, Daddy this, Daddy that. Can you just stop asking questions? And a lot of times that's the parent's emotion because they don't know the answers to these questions. And a lot of times the parents are not willing to say, I don't know, that needs to be in my experiment basket too, But as parents, we often want to give the impression we know, and so we want to shut the child down if they ask a question we don't know the answer to. Many of you have seen children ask me the question, where did God come from? It's mostly children that ask that question, and you've seen me give the answer. I've got no idea, is my answer. And child goes, okay, and then moves on to the next question, right? It's very rare for an adult to ask that question because they want to have the idea inside of themselves that they would know the answer, or it's one of those questions that confounds them and they don't like being in a permanent state of being confounded. Right? So when you experiment, you're able to be in a permanent state of being confounded on that subject until it gets an answer. What if it's 10 years? Were you willing to be confounded for 10 years? Does that make sense? If you're truly open, you'll be willing to be confounded. So this is what the child does through the experiment process. Can you see why we don't want to experiment very much? Yeah. And can we just say something about, because we haven't listed the primary, one of the things, the child does not care, no care about mistakes. It's only when we punish the child, or punish the children, that it begins to feel a consequence for a mistake. Right? And once it starts associating pain with the mistake, it's going to try to avoid mistakes. Right? But the problem with avoiding mistakes is if you avoid mistakes, you also avoid experimentation. Do you think that the average scientist gets out there, creates an experiment, and it works 100% of the time, every time, the first time? Like, you have some scientists doing experiment after experiment after experiment for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years before they find an answer. That's a willingness to make mistake after mistake after mistake after mistake after mistake until they get an answer. That's the attitude we need to have in our life. Okay, good.
I notice it's all a buzz, but at the moment, I notice the kids aren't thinking about the future and not about the past. They're living as things happen.
So they're in the present. Are present in a discussion with the person. As an adult, you think a lot of the times when we ask a question, we're not really asking a lot of the times the question that we really needed to ask. We're asking a question that usually is modified for public consumption and has very little to do with our personal life because we don't like to mention our personal life. So what we do is we think, oh yeah, the other day, give an example. The other day, yeah, like I really thought like I would like to have sex with that person who's not my partner. Now, I can't really say that in a public group and feel, without feeling judged and all these other things. So what I'll do is I'll say the question like this. What if somebody actually has thoughts about having, has lustful thoughts about another person who's not their partner? Now, can you see I've now disassociated the actual question from myself. I've pushed it away from myself. I'm already in modification because of my own judgment of the actual issue. So therefore, I'm already in fear, right? I've already got an investment in the outcome. I'm already closing myself down towards experimentation. Does that make sense? This is what we do automatically. Okay, so now that we've got this on the board, we can see that what we need to do is marry or amalgamate these two concepts together. The concept of intellectually working something out and emotionally working something out. And we need to see that a lot of the times we are very versed in this part because we've been brought up with this part. And in particular, the part that we're the most versed in is these two parts here. That's where most of the world that we live in operates. Might just draw it again. Most of the world operates in this area here. These brand new markers are not very good markers. Most of the world operates there, in that area there, where they believe they know what's loving in their mind, or they believe they know what's not loving in their mind, and they act according to that every single time without any experimentation, without any further information available. Now, some people have grown to this part, and you see this happening on a physical level with scientists in particular. Where they are in the first part, where they are experimenting through an intellectual process. So they're already going through that in a physical layer. Most scientists are very adverse to going through it in a spiritual layer, or spirit body layer, if you like, metaphysical layer, or a soul-based layer. But there are some scientists who are now doing that, and so they are willing to experiment intellectually in those regards. Most of us are totally inept when it comes to this side, the whole emotional side, particularly when we start, right? Because we've become so detuned from the childlike process of experimenting, we've become so detuned from our emotions altogether that we don't even, or rarely even, know when we're experiencing an emotion. Right, so this is a main problem that we have for many of us. But what I'm saying is, if you want to determine truth on any subject in the universe, that's the scope, and you need to do both things. At the same time. You need to compare these things. Because, and we can come up with many examples in a minute of how to go ahead with these particular experiments, if you like, of what's actually going on. Because there are some general things that we can do that will help us to determine whether we're actually getting anywhere near the truth, or whether we're still a long way away from the truth or not. Is there any questions before we proceed? Everyone's okay with that as a general concept? Okay. So it's a very general concept of how to go about discovering truth. Mary, you'd like to say?
I was just going to say that, like, we live in a very postmodernist world, which just says that you can't ever know truth.
Exactly.
And
now, can I just say that whenever we have the attitude we can't ever know truth, then it's highly unlikely we're ever going to experiment.
Yeah, it seems to me the ultimate way to avoid the first two top columns.
It is.
And it seems to me for me personally to be driven by a sense of hopelessness or disillusionment, where obviously this feeling that I can't ever experiment with things has just been totally squashed somehow, or I've felt that past experiments have led me to more uncertainty.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm very interested in this.
And yet, what does a child do?
Just continues on. Asking questions.
Exactly. See, a child always trusts that the truth is available. Yeah. Always. Like a child never goes, oh, the truth's not available, so I won't even ask Daddy that. You don't see children doing that until they start getting shut down from their parents. You don't see them doing that. Why? Because they trust that the truth is always available. And I believe God put in us this underlying feeling inside of us that we can trust the fact that truth is available. And
that we're sort of wired to search for truth,
to find it. Yeah.
And if I look at the physical world, it's so obvious. that
Yes.
man wants to go to Mars and do everything to discover the truth of the physical world. But this, I suppose, this is kind of a spiritual wasteland now in terms of a feeling like, well, there's many truths, there's not. And for me, I find it, for myself, very confronting just to know there is one truth.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I have to be humble enough to find it.
But the interesting thing is a child believes there is one truth on any subject.
Inherently. Yeah.
Which is an interesting concept in itself. You see, that's why I said in the first century that you must become like a little child to enter the kingdom of God. Because without these ways of seeing things, you're not able to experiment. So you're never going to become a person who understands truth.
And it seems to me also that the law of attraction is the way for us to experiment. Like God's created a feedback system already.
Yeah, I'd call the law of attraction a feedback system.
Yeah.
It's not the way to experiment, because you can experiment by not having things be attracted to you that are negative or positive. You can experiment by observing other people's negative and positive attractions. That's one way of experimenting. So there are many ways to experiment, not just your own law of attraction. Yeah. Sorry?
Where does the belief fit in then? Is it an intellectual thing?
Well, some of our beliefs are intellectual and some of our beliefs are emotional. And some of what we call our subconscious beliefs are actually emotional. So it could be either. And the key with all of our belief systems is, while we're unsure, we just need to put it in the unsure box.
And then it'll become a feeling.
Well, it's only when the feeling and the thought and this is something I haven't yet mentioned to you, and it's something that I must mention to you. This area here is very important. These areas here. You could almost draw a grid of all of this stuff, right? The second point in both areas are very important to you. Because if something is emotional, harmonious with love and truth, and intellectual at the same time, harmonious with love and truth, you can be very, very certain that it is actually God's truth. All right? So this is a very important thing to understand. If that and that are both in play at the same time, then there's a very, very good chance that what you've now discovered is not only a truth about yourself, but also a truth about the universe as well. Something that's what you would say is absolute truth. Yeah. So the beauty of absolute truth is that it's always in this domain, in the domain of number 2 of both columns. Right? Absolute truth is always in that domain. Yeah. Vera?
I'm confused. So if you're feeling something inside yourself, and the feeling is that it's love, and intellectually you're able to examine it and say, yes, that's love.
That seems like love to me, yes.
So that's what you're saying, when the mind and the emotions marry up.
Yes, when you feel a feeling of love, at the same time as you intellectually analyse the thing and you have the thought that there is a love here as well. So for example, if many times we're not honest with ourselves, and this is the underlying thing that we need to be, is honest with ourselves. Many times people say to me, oh, I think that is the most loving thing to do. For example, Many people who are members of a religion tell me that it's right for them to excommunicate gay people from the religion. In other words, that it's right for them to remove a person who's homosexual from the religion, right? Now, and many times their intellectual thought is that that is the loving thing to do. But let's look at the emotions. What's the feeling they have whenever they think of a gay couple?
How, like, if they knew that it was unloving?
No, what I'm saying is they don't know because they've separated the emotion from the intellect. See, what they've done is they've looked at what they believe is a rule book, they call the Bible, or God's word, and in there, in the 1 Corinthians, it actually says that gay people or homosexuals will not inherit God's kingdom. That's what it says there. And so they've now intellectually accepted that as a truth without feeling about it.
So they've blocked themselves from the feeling of it.
Yes, because if they felt their feeling, they would feel this feeling of anger towards homosexuals, the feeling of wanting to punish a homosexual, a lot of feelings that are present there in the statement.
They might be feeling those things and thinking it's okay. Because I think I've done stuff like that.
Yeah,
Not
no,
in that instance.
I agree. I agree. But what I'm saying is that when you're angry, are you loving? Obviously not. We can tell ourselves we are. This is where we need to be honest with ourselves. See, self-honesty is the underlying crux of all of this diagram, if you like, of how we can discover truth. If we're not honest with ourselves, we'll lie to ourselves about whether we feel love or not. So I've seen a person yelling at a homosexual, saying that he loves him. Actually yelling at him, screaming at him, saying that he loves him. I can't agree. The fact that you're yelling and screaming means you don't, right in that moment, love the person. So, and if the person themselves who is doing the yelling and screaming sat down and imagined himself or herself being yelled and screamed at, would she then or he then feel that they're being treated lovingly? I would argue with you that they would definitely not feel it if they were on the receiving end of it. They would see instantly that they're being unloving. And this is what we need to do. We need to start allowing ourselves to be far more self-reflective, as Connie pointed out. So if we're not self-reflective, then we are going to justify unloving behaviour. And we're going to tell ourselves that we're being loving, but it's only an intellectual thought. I'm saying that what we need to do is be far more open than that. That's what we need to do. And one of the main reasons why we justify rage-based behaviour is due to our own addictions. And this is where I'm going with this. So in the next part of the discussion, we'll look at the general layer of emotion that causes us to believe that we are doing the right thing when we're actually doing the wrong thing. Yeah.
Pues hasta aquí esta primera parte del vídeo, que son un poco más de 2 horas. Voy a cerrar un minuto la persiana y decidimos cómo estamos, si hacemos otro vídeo para un comentario o algo así.
Ahí te está señalando a vos para que hagas una pregunta.
Sí. No quiero. Me quiero quedar.
Súper interesante.
Mi creencia.
Ya sé la verdad.
Ya lo sé.
Ya acepto.
Nos quedamos ahí con nuestras adicciones sin destripar. Fíjate, estos son como 2 años antes, bueno, 2 años antes de los grupos del 2014, donde ya se ponía a reunir a la gente en plan 8 días, vamos a a verlo todo lo de las adicciones despacio y luego Dios y no sé qué.
Y el de 2014 es el que comienza a desgranar, que ya van quedando menos a medida que avanzan.
Sí, en uno de ellos pasa eso. Y creo que también en el 2016 también les pasa eso. En alguno. Aunque no tan exagerado como el de 2014, creo, por lo que vi.
Sí, que notamos. Sí, en la de... Ahí estaba Cornelius también. Sí, me acuerdo.
Bueno, entonces
Iban...
comentamos una cosa en otro vídeo.
Dale.
Para no asustar con este, ya que es tan interesante, que no sea más de 1 hora y pico.
Bueno.
Vale, pues ahí mismo. Por ejemplo, bueno, podemos proponer en 1 minuto o 2 los ejemplos que se te ocurran. A mí se me ocurre hablar de una cosa que comentan otros sitios, Miller, pues, y que es muy evidente, el ritual, ¿no? ¿Qué sucede cuando tenemos ciertos sentimientos de amor, cuando vamos a un ritual de alguna iglesia o alguna cosa, las creencias que hay en torno a ello? Entonces, solamente decirlo, que eso es lo que voy a proponer hablar ahora, y tú propon otro para que sepan de qué vamos a hablar, si se te ocurre, y si no, pues ya, ahora seguimos.
No, un poco que, bueno, lo que venimos hablando de respecto de las intervenciones que hacemos y cómo vamos de alguna manera coartando el proceso que después nos convertimos en estos adultos cerrados a la experimentación. Así llegamos a eso.
¿Qué nos han hecho y qué hemos hecho con los niños, con la educación, te refieres?
Sí.
Vale. Bueno, pues gracias y hasta luego. Despídete del amado público con el que hemos visualizado.
Gracias. Hasta el próximo.